There must be something wrong with me. That's the thought, the one so many of us have carried for decades. Not because anyone said those exact words, but because when the people who were supposed to love us didn't, we were children. And a child makes sense of the impossible the only way she can. It must be me. Some of us carry that verdict our whole lives. It has a name, and it's not a character flaw. It's called complex PTSD, and millions of women living with it don't even know it has a name. They've spent years believing they were simply too sensitive, too emotional, too needy, too broken. But they weren't broken. They were surviving. Today, we're going to name the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD. Not a psychology lesson, but because sometimes understanding what happened to us is the first step toward finally understanding ourselves. What is PTSD? PTSD usually develops after a specific traumatic event. One event, one experience that overwhelms the brain's ability to cope. Combat, a serious accident, a natural disaster, witnessing someone die. The event ends, but your nervous system doesn't get the message. It stays on high alert, as if danger is still just around the corner. That's why people experience flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, avoidance, a startle response that feels impossible to control. The body keeps preparing for a threat that is no longer there. In many ways, PTSD keeps asking one question: what happened? What is CPTSD? Complex PTSD develops differently, not from one traumatic event, but from repeated trauma, prolonged trauma, the kind you couldn't escape. It often begins in childhood: emotional abuse, chronic neglect, growing up with narcissistic parents, domestic violence, living inside long-term family dysfunction. The danger wasn't one terrible day. The danger became the environment. Home wasn't always where you felt safest. Sometimes home was where you learned to stay small, to stay quiet, to read everyone's mood before you even spoke, to apologize for things that weren't your fault, to disappear because disappearing felt safer than being seen. The difference no one talks about: PTSD changes how you experience danger. CPTSD changes how you experience yourself. PTSD affects fear, safety, trauma memories. CPTSD reaches much deeper. It changes identity, self-worth, relationships, boundaries, trust, emotional regulation. PTSD often asks, am I safe? CPTSD often asks, am I lovable? PTSD says, the world is dangerous. CPTSD whispers something far more devastating: there must be something wrong with me. That's the lie, the one we opened with, the one so many of us have believed since before we had the words for it. If the people who are supposed to love me don't, it must be me. If I'm constantly criticized, it must be me. If affection has to be earned, it must be me. Children almost never blame the adults. They blame themselves. And some of us carry that verdict for decades. The daughter wound. This is why so many women discover complex PTSD while trying to understand something else entirely. Why relationships feel exhausting. Why boundaries feel terrifying. Why rejection feels catastrophic. Why one critical comment can undo an entire week. Why people pleasing feels automatic. Why saying no fills you with guilt. Why abandonment feels unbearable. Why estrangement hurts in places no one else can see. The daughter wound isn't just about difficult mothers. It's about growing up believing love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, that your value depended on your usefulness, your obedience, your silence, your perfection. When those messages are repeated year after year, they don't just shape your childhood, they become the voice inside your own head. Hope and healing. Here's what we hope you hear today. Complex PTSD is not a character flaw. It is not weakness. It is not proof that you are broken. It is evidence that your nervous system adapted to survive circumstances it never should have had to endure. Everything your body learned, it learned to keep you alive. That doesn't mean those patterns still serve you, but it does mean they make sense. Healing isn't pretending those years never happened. Healing isn't becoming the person you would have been if none of this had happened. None of us gets that life. Healing is becoming the person you choose to be now, one boundary at a time, one truth at a time, one act of self-compassion at a time. Because survival was never your identity. It was simply the strategy that carried you here. And now, for perhaps the first time, you get to decide who you become next.